The ranch hands sit around the supper table after one of the hardest days of the season. Everyone is unusually quiet. One cowboy finally breaks the silence.
This is the best stew I've ever tasted. Better than anything I've had in years.
Caleb slowly looks around the table, then asks only one question: who made this stew? A young woman standing quietly in the kitchen lowers her eyes. Softly she answers, I did. The entire room falls silent. No one expected those 3 words. Because the woman who made that meal had spent her whole life believing she didn't deserve a place at anyone's table. The first light of morning settled gently across the Wyoming Valley, painting the ranch in soft shades of gold while a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and pine through the air. Long before the ranch hands stirred from their bunks or the horses stamped impatiently inside the barn, the kitchen remained silent, waiting for another day to begin. For years it had been Mrs. Harper who greeted each sunrise there, preparing breakfast before anyone else had even opened their eyes. But illness had a way of changing routines that once seemed permanent. Her hands, once steady enough to knead bread and stir heavy pots for an entire ranch, could no longer bear the weight of the work. The old house felt strangely empty without the familiar sounds of her cooking. Caleb noticed it more than anyone. Though he rarely spoke about such things, he understood how much a warm meal held a household together. Since losing his wife several years earlier, he had grown accustomed to silence. He buried himself in ranch work from sunrise until well after dark, convincing himself that hard work was enough to fill the empty spaces left behind. Yet each evening, when the long table echoed with fewer conversations than before, he couldn't help feeling that something important had quietly slipped away. Mrs. Harper knew it too. One afternoon, while resting beneath a quilt beside the front window, she spoke with the local pastor who had come to check on her condition. I know someone, the pastor said after a thoughtful pause. A young woman looking for honest work. Mrs. Harper smiled faintly. Can she cook? The pastor chuckled. From what I've heard, she can do far more than that. 2 days later, just as the afternoon train disappeared beyond the hills, a young woman made her way up the dusty road leading toward the ranch. She carried only a weathered leather satchel over one shoulder and a small wooden recipe notebook held carefully against her chest, as though it contained something far more valuable than recipes. Her dress was plain, her boots showed signs of many miles of walking, and there was nothing about her appearance that demanded attention. Yet there was a quiet grace in the way she carried herself, neither hurried nor uncertain, simply steady. Her name was Emma. When she reached the porch, she removed her hat politely and waited. Caleb opened the front door after hearing the knock. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You must be Emma, he finally said. She nodded gently. The pastor sent me. Caleb glanced toward the satchel resting at her side. You travel light. I've learned I don't need much. There was no sadness in her voice. Only acceptance. He stepped aside and motioned toward the kitchen. Come inside. Emma quietly thanked him before entering the house. Her eyes wandered across the room, taking in the worn wooden table, the aging stove, the neatly stacked cast iron pots, and the familiar signs of a kitchen that had served generations of hard-working people. Rather than judging what needed replacing, she seemed to appreciate everything that had been cared for. Mrs. Harper welcomed her warmly. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, the older woman said. Emma smiled. I'm grateful we're meeting at all. After discussing the work, Caleb asked the question every employer eventually asked. And your wages? Emma hesitated only briefly. A warm kitchen is enough. Caleb looked at her, unsure he had heard correctly. You'll be doing more work than that deserves. She lowered her eyes with a quiet smile. I've never measured kindness by money. The answer lingered in the room. Mrs. Harper watched Caleb carefully, wondering how he would respond. Finally, he nodded toward the pantry and the stove. Cook whatever you think folks need. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a test. It was trust. Emma accepted it with a simple nod. She unpacked her notebook first, placing it gently on the counter before arranging every utensil with quiet precision. She tied on a plain apron, rolled up her sleeves, and without another word, began working as though she had always belonged there. By evening, the smell of slow-simmering stew drifted through every corner of the ranch. Fresh bread baked inside the old oven while herbs crackled gently in melted butter. One by one, the ranch hands wandered inside, surprised to find a meal unlike anything they had tasted in months. One of them whispered quietly to another, "She won't last a week." Another shrugged. "Maybe." Emma heard every word. She simply continued serving bowls without the slightest change in expression. She made certain every plate was full before finally setting the ladle down. Only after every person had eaten did she quietly gather the empty bowls. She never fixed herself a plate. She folded the remaining bread inside a clean linen cloth instead of throwing it away, carefully wrapped the leftover stew in a small container, and quietly finished washing the dishes long after everyone else had gone to bed. Caleb noticed. He had watched people work his ranch for years. He had seen those who worked only for wages and those who worked only when someone was watching. Emma was different. She served as though no act of kindness was ever too small to matter. Late that night, unable to sleep, Caleb stepped outside onto the porch. Moonlight stretched across the yard, and just beyond the barn he caught sight of a lone lantern moving slowly through the darkness. It was Emma. Holding the bundle of bread beneath one arm and the container of stew in the other, she quietly slipped through the ranch gate and disappeared down the lonely trail beyond the pasture. Caleb watched her until the lantern faded into the night. She wasn't saving leftovers. She was taking them somewhere. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he found himself wondering who Emma really was, and why she seemed to care so deeply about people no one else could see. A few mornings later, the ranch awakened to something that no one could quite explain. The sun still rose over the distant hills. The horses still waited impatiently to be fed. The ranch hands still gathered around the long wooden table before beginning another day's work. Yet somehow, everything felt different. It began with breakfast. The biscuits were warm enough to melt butter before it touched the plate. Fresh herbs, gathered from the small garden behind the house, added a fragrance that drifted through every room. Eggs were cooked exactly the way each ranch hand preferred, though no one could remember ever telling Emma how they liked them. The coffee was richer, the preserves sweeter, and even the simplest bowl of oatmeal somehow carried the comforting taste of home. No one could explain it. They only knew they found themselves lingering at the table a little longer each morning. Before long, supper became the meal everyone looked forward to most. Emma never relied on expensive ingredients. She believed that good food wasn't measured by what it cost but by the care with which it was prepared. She refused to waste anything. Yesterday's vegetables became today's hearty soup. Stale bread found new life as buttery stuffing. Bones that others would have discarded simmered for hours until they became rich broth that warmed both body and spirit. Little by little, the atmosphere around the ranch began to change. Men who once hurried through their meals now stayed behind to finish their conversations. Arguments that had once echoed through the barn seemed to disappear. Laughter became a familiar sound again, floating from the dining room windows long after the last plates had been cleared. Even Caleb noticed the difference. He had spent years believing that hard work alone held a ranch together. Now he was beginning to wonder if perhaps it was something much simpler. Perhaps it was a warm meal shared around a full table. Emma, however, never acted as though any of the praise belonged to her. Long before the first ranch hand woke each morning, she quietly moved through the house with a lantern in one hand and her recipe notebook tucked beneath the other arm. While bread baked inside the oven, she repaired torn aprons with neat, careful stitches. She sharpened kitchen knives until they glided effortlessly through vegetables. She scrubbed old pots until they shone again, though no one had asked her to. Before sunrise each morning, she carried a pot of fresh coffee outside and quietly placed it beside the barn doors for the men beginning the earliest chores. No note. No announcement. No expectation that anyone would know who had left it there. When the ranch hands thanked Mrs. Harper, the elderly housekeeper only smiled. When they guessed Caleb had thought of it, he simply shook his head. Emma never corrected them. She never accepted the credit. To her, kindness lost something precious the moment it expected applause. One afternoon, while preparing bread for the following day, she noticed a small face peeking cautiously around the kitchen doorway. It was Lily, the young daughter of a neighboring rancher. The little girl had always been curious, but she had never ventured inside before. Emma looked up and smiled. "Would you like to help?" Lily nodded eagerly. From that day forward, the kitchen gained its smallest assistant. Emma patiently showed her how to sift flour without rushing, how to knead dough gently instead of forcing it, and how to wait for bread to rise instead of trying to hurry it along. "Bread teaches patience," Emma said one afternoon as Lily pressed tiny hands into the soft dough. "And patience?" Lily asked. Emma smiled. "It teaches kindness." The little girl frowned thoughtfully. "I thought we were learning recipes." "We are," Emma replied softly. "But recipes are easy to remember. It's the reasons we cook that matter." Lily never forgot those words. Neither did Caleb. He happened to pass by the open kitchen window just as Emma spoke them, and for reasons he couldn't explain, they lingered with him throughout the rest of the day. Who was this young woman? How had someone so young learned lessons that seemed to belong to a lifetime? The questions quietly multiplied. So did the admiration. One evening, after another memorable supper, the ranch hands leaned back from the table with satisfied smiles. One of them laughed as he reached for another biscuit. "I've eaten in cattle camps from Texas to Montana," he said. "Nobody learns to cook like this without a story." The room fell quiet. Several heads turned toward Emma. She paused only long enough to look up from washing the dishes. A gentle smile crossed her face. Then she simply returned to her work. She offered no explanation. No story. No defense. Her silence somehow answered less than words ever could. Caleb watched her carefully. Most people guarded secrets out of fear. Emma guarded hers with peace. That difference stayed with him. Later that evening, after the dishes had been washed and every lantern inside the house had been extinguished, Caleb remained awake on the porch. He had told himself he was only enjoying the cool night air. But when he saw Emma quietly step out of the kitchen carrying another cloth-wrapped loaf of bread beneath one arm and a small covered pot in the other, curiosity finally overcame restraint. Keeping a respectful distance, he followed silently as she walked beyond the barn, through the moonlit pasture, and down the narrow trail disappearing into the darkness. She never looked back. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. And as Caleb watched her disappear beyond the edge of the ranch with yet another meal meant for someone else, he realized the missing bread had never truly been missing at all. It had simply been feeding someone the rest of the world had forgotten. And for the first time since Emma arrived, Caleb decided he needed to know who that someone was. The following evening, the ranch settled into its familiar rhythm once again. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the rolling hills as the ranch hands finished supper and drifted toward the bunkhouse, their laughter carrying softly across the quiet yard. Inside the kitchen, Emma moved through the familiar routine of washing dishes, wiping down the wooden counters, and wrapping the remaining bread in clean linen. She worked with the same quiet care she gave to everything else, never appearing hurried, never asking for help. Caleb watched from the porch without letting her notice. The questions that had followed him for days had only grown louder. Every evening she disappeared with food. Every morning she returned before sunrise as though nothing had happened. She never explained herself, and somehow that silence revealed more about her character than words ever could. When the ranch finally fell asleep, Emma slipped quietly through the back door carrying the familiar bundle beneath her arm. This time, Caleb followed. Keeping several yards behind, he watched her lantern sway gently as she crossed the pasture and disappeared into the trees beyond the property. The trail narrowed until it reached an abandoned cabin tucked against the edge of the woods. Its roof sagged with age, one window was boarded shut, and smoke barely escaped from a crooked chimney. Emma knocked softly before entering. Caleb remained outside, unseen. Through the dim glow of the cabin window, he saw an elderly man struggling to rise from a worn rocking chair. It was Samuel. Years earlier, Samuel had worked beside Caleb during some of the ranch's hardest seasons. Age and illness had slowly stolen his strength until he could no longer work. Everyone believed someone in town was checking on him. Others assumed distant relatives had taken responsibility. The truth was far quieter. No one had been coming. Except Emma. She placed the fresh bread on the table before carefully serving 2 bowls of stew. She didn't simply leave the meal behind. She pulled out the second chair and sat across from him as though they had shared supper together for years. Samuel smiled the moment she sat down. "I was beginning to think you'd let an old man eat alone tonight." Emma laughed softly. "I've never been late." "That's true," Samuel admitted with a grin. "You always come." They bowed their heads together before eating. For several moments, neither of them spoke. They simply shared the meal in comfortable silence. Finally, Samuel looked toward her with grateful eyes. "You always bring enough for 2. Emma smiled as she broke another piece of bread in half. No one should eat alone. The simple sentence settled deeply inside Caleb's heart. She wasn't feeding Samuel because she felt sorry for him. She was giving him something even more valuable than food. She was giving him company. After supper, Samuel excused himself to fetch more firewood, leaving Emma alone inside the cabin. She opened the small wooden recipe notebook she carried everywhere, gently running her fingers across its worn pages. Curiosity drew Caleb a little closer to the window. He never intended to invade her privacy, but the lantern light illuminated the handwritten notes between the recipes. One page read, "Mother made this during the drought, when all we had was 1 potato and hope." Another recipe carried different words. "Feed 6, with enough left for 1 more, because you never know who might arrive hungry." Further down another page she had written, "A meal fills a stomach. Sharing it fills a heart." Caleb slowly lowered his eyes. In that moment, he understood. The notebook wasn't a collection of recipes. It was a family legacy. Every meal carried a memory. Every ingredient carried compassion. Emma hadn't inherited remarkable cooking. She had inherited a way of loving people. Food had never been the point. People were. Without making a sound, Caleb stepped away from the cabin. He didn't need answers anymore. The mystery that had first captured his curiosity had quietly transformed into admiration. Whatever pain Emma carried belonged to her alone, and for the first time, he understood that earning someone's trust sometimes meant choosing not to ask questions. As he walked back beneath the moonlit sky, he found himself smiling. The ranch hadn't simply hired a cook. It had welcomed someone capable of changing lives 1 meal at a time. 2 days later, preparations for the annual harvest supper filled the ranch with excitement. Mrs. Harper happily assigned chores while neighbors arrived carrying baskets of vegetables, fresh butter, and homemade pies. Everyone expected Emma to take her place at the center of the celebration. Instead, while folding fresh table linens, Emma spoke quietly enough that only Mrs. Harper could hear. "I don't think I'll be attending." The older woman looked at her in surprise. "You've done more for this supper than anyone." Emma simply smiled, lowered her eyes, and returned to her work. Mrs. Harper watched her for a long moment, wondering why the woman who had brought everyone together seemed determined to remain in the background. And for the first time, Caleb realized that Emma's greatest struggle wasn't learning how to belong. It was believing she deserved to. As preparations for the annual harvest supper filled the ranch with excitement, Mrs. Harper quietly shared something Caleb had never known. Years earlier, Emma's family had lost nearly everything during a devastating drought. There were days when they barely had enough to feed themselves, yet Emma's mother became known throughout neighboring towns, not because she possessed wealth, but because no hungry child who knocked on her door was ever turned away. She used to say, Mrs. Harper whispered, that a bowl of stew could restore more than strength, it could restore a person's dignity. Caleb finally understood that Emma hadn't learned to cook simply to make good meals. She had learned that kindness could be served one bowl at a time. Later that evening, the harvest supper was thrown into chaos. Several dishes were ruined, supplies began running low, and worried voices quickly filled the kitchen. While everyone else panicked, Emma remained calm. She quietly reorganized the work, stretched every remaining ingredient, added fresh bread, vegetables, and broth until one pot became enough for everyone. By nightfall, every family at the gathering had a warm meal in their hands, and not a single person left hungry. As the last bowls were served, whispers drifted through the crowd. "That isn't cooking." Another voice answered softly. "No. That's love." Standing across the room, Caleb watched Emma smile as she handed away the very last bowl of stew. Then he looked at the empty pot. Only then did he realize something that stopped him in his tracks. After feeding everyone else, Emma had never served herself a single bowl. The evening after the harvest supper, the ranch felt quieter than usual. The excitement had faded, and the last light of day settled gently across the porch of the farmhouse. Emma finished washing the final dishes and reached for her apron, expecting another evening of work before everyone else had gone to bed. But when she stepped outside, she stopped. Caleb was already sitting on the porch. Between them rested a small wooden table. On it sat 2 steaming bowls of stew. One for him. One for her. Emma looked at the bowls, then back at Caleb. "I still have work," she said softly, almost as though she needed an excuse not to sit down. Caleb smiled gently. "The work will still be there tomorrow." She hesitated. He looked at the bowl in front of her and quietly added, "Tonight, someone cooked for you." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. For a long moment, Emma couldn't move. She searched his face, almost expecting him to laugh or tell her he was joking. But he wasn't. He had made the meal himself. Not because he was trying to impress her. Not because he expected anything in return. Simply because he wanted someone who spent every day caring for others to know what it felt like to be cared for. Slowly, she took her seat. She wrapped both hands around the warm bowl, but before she lifted the spoon, tears quietly filled her eyes. Caleb said nothing. He understood that some moments were too important to interrupt. After a long silence, Emma finally spoke. "I've spent so long making sure everyone else was full." Her voice trembled. "That I forgot what it felt like to be cared for." Caleb looked at her with the same quiet kindness that had welcomed her on the day she arrived. "You don't have to earn your place here," he said. "You already have one." Emma lowered her eyes as a tear slipped gently down her cheek. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe that someone meant those words. She wasn't valued because of the meals she cooked. She wasn't wanted because of the work she could do. She was wanted simply because she was Emma. A small smile slowly found its way across her face. She lifted the spoon, tasted the stew Caleb had prepared for her, and laughed softly through her tears. Then, without another word, she pulled her chair a little closer to his. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she chose not only to stay. She chose to belong. Several months passed, and with them came quiet changes that no one had expected. The ranch still woke before sunrise. Horses still filled the pasture, wagons still rolled through the front gate, and the day's work remained as demanding as ever. But something had changed that couldn't be measured by fuller barns or healthier fields. The heart of the ranch was no longer the stable. It was the kitchen. Every morning, the comforting scent of fresh bread drifted through the open windows before the first ranch hand had even saddled a horse. The sound of laughter had replaced the silence that once lingered inside the farmhouse. Men who had once hurried through their meals now stayed a little longer, sharing stories around the table before heading back to work. Little Lily had become Emma's faithful helper. Standing on a wooden stool beside the counter, she proudly kneaded dough with flour covering the tip of her nose. Emma smiled as she gently corrected her tiny hands. "Not too hard," she whispered. "Bread likes patience." Lily giggled. "I'm learning." "You are," Emma replied warmly. "And one day, you'll teach someone else." Across the room, Mrs. Harper watched with quiet pride. She no longer worried about who would care for the kitchen. She had already found the person who belonged there. Even Samuel had changed. The lonely cabin at the edge of the woods was no longer where he spent his evenings. Every night, someone from the ranch stopped by to bring him home for supper. Before long, no one even remembered the nights when he had eaten alone. Because on Caleb's ranch, no one ate alone anymore. As the family gathered around the long wooden table that evening, Emma did something she had never done when she first arrived. She didn't wait for everyone else to finish. She didn't remain standing in the kitchen. She quietly pulled out the chair beside Caleb before the meal even began. Not as a worker. Not as a guest. But as family. Caleb looked around the crowded table. Mrs. Harper was smiling. Samuel was laughing at one of the ranch hand's stories. Lily could hardly sit still, eager to show everyone the biscuits she had helped bake. For a long moment, Caleb simply took it all in. Months ago, this house had echoed with silence. Now it echoed with life. He lifted his spoon, glanced toward the steaming pot in the center of the table, and with a smile that reached his eyes, asked, "So, who made this stew?" The room grew quiet for only a heartbeat before every face turned toward Emma. She looked around the table at the people who had become her family. Then, for the very first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she laughed without hesitation. "I did," she said. Caleb tasted another spoonful, nodded slowly, and smiled. "Then I hope you never stop." Emma lowered her eyes, her smile growing even warmer. Not because he was praising the meal. But because, for the first time in her life, she knew she had finally found a place where she didn't have to earn love. She simply belonged. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes the smallest bowl of stew can nourish far more than hunger. It can remind a lonely heart that kindness is never wasted, love is often spoken through quiet actions, and the place where you are truly seen will always feel like home.